this video, I want to kind of maybe start off, this may be the first or the second video that I do for the series about going for the CAPK. I basically want to talk about the CAPK because I think it's one of the most popular arguments that you'll see in policy debate. I definitely think no matter what circuit you're in, there's a possibility that you will see the CAPK in one way or another. And so I think it's worth definitely talking about in a little bit of detail, because I think a lot of the skills that you get from understanding how to answer it and understanding how to go for it can be really helpful for how you respond or how you go for other types of criticisms. And I think a lot of the skills that you get from learning about this argument are really transferable to a type of arguments that you're gonna want to make later on the line, no matter what argument you're reading. I think that although this argument is read a lot in terms of people putting it in the 1 and C or possibly putting it in the block, I don't think there are a lot of teams that really specialize in going for this argument and making a legitimate strategy that they can go for like any round against like any type of argument. But I do think this argument has the flexibility to be that good. It has such a large literature base with so many examples and authors in history that you can cite, that I think that it really is useful against like a host of arguments, even arguments that are about capitalism, because there are authors that disagree with each other within the literature base for all different types of reasons. So I think it's like really good to just be able to cite well-known history and a lot of examples of like successful organizing or unsuccessful organizing in order to kind of be able to go for this criticism in all different types of contexts. In this particular initial video, I'm going to talk about going for the CAPK against policy teams. None of these videos will really kind of go over the CAPK as a literature base or do like a lecture on like anti-capitalist literature, simply because I don't have enough time in this type of video. But I do think that it's worth talking about the different types of arguments or the different types of moves you should be making with this argument in order to make it really successful. And I think it's worth talking about the ways in which you can execute it better if you already are going for this argument and need an idea of the types of like things that you should be checking off from thinking about from someone else's perspective that has gone for it. So just general tips. First, I want to start off with the maybe framework of the debate. I think that against policy teams, usually I think this is the place that is maybe not the most strategically useful for either side, because you're going to be able to like weigh the impacts of the criticism, and those impacts of the criticism on the CAPK when you're talking about things like climate change, when you're talking about things like war, etc., are impacts that you'll see like really common when you're talking about like resource scarcity in the context of capitalism, which means that you'll have a lot of arguments or impacts that have like high probability and a high risk being able to interact with a lot of different policy arguments, or being able to magnify the types of impacts that different types of policy teams are going to be able to read. And so being able to kind of weigh those against the plain text in a vacuum is usually not a problem. I think that it's really just a question of the relationship between the types of impacts that you want to go for and your ability to go for the alternative later on in the debate. I think that you need to make sure that, and I'll talk about this later on in the video, that your alternative has a really neat interaction with your impact where you're able to win that it resolves all of the impacts, or is able to create a starting point for organizing how we resolve those impacts in such a way that you're able to get the full weight out of using those impacts against the affirmative. And so in order to do so, I think that it can sometimes be helpful for taking maybe the things like the role of the ballot or the role of the judge to make arguments about why specifically thinking from the heuristic of being an anti-capitalist from the position of the judge is like incredibly important for the types of decisions that we make going forward, and how we think about the way in which the alt is weighed against the AF. Because I think the only downfall to not really putting in a bunch of time on the framework portion of this particular type of argument is that you run the risk of the judge being able to decide the debate through the lens of a policymaker, which can make it a lot harder to kind of like weigh the efficiency or the ability for you to get the full magnitude out of the like praxis of the alternative and some of the organizing model stuff we'll talk about later, and in a lot of other videos that we'll have about capitalism. So I think at kind of like a top level, like overview structural critique level, you should be stressing the relationship between the alternative and the impacts the most here. So I'm thinking about the place where you kind of have that like first card in your 1C that really gives you your like thesis argument about capitalism, your 2NC overview, your 2NR overview, the place where you really want the judge to understand the kind of like thesis of the structural argument you're making about capitalism. And I think you need to kind of pull out a lot of the interesting relationships between the alternative and the impacts here, and explain to the judge how they should be understanding the interaction between those two things, because that is going to frame how you get weight for the impacts that you'll want to make later on in the debate. I think that the way that you can do this is that you need to make arguments about how the urgency of the instability of capitalism and other preempts that you can make against like a possible impact turn debate makes it like incredibly urgent that we find solutions to capitalism now, which can make it more urgent to use the alternative or the way that you're thinking about the criticism as a starting point for how we're able to think about resolving the impacts or thinking about the impacts in comparison towards each other, even if you're not able to resolve resolve them in the same way that a plan text would be able to, and the alternative is simply a starting point for how we should think about what organization looks like. I think that the being able to make these types of arguments are both useful, kind of like I said, because they're able to get you more weight for the impact arguments, but they're also, like I said, able to preempt those kind of like impact turn debates that teams can always pivot to against the Cap K, even if they pivot into one that's just more like capitalism is all we have now. Capitalism is necessary and sustainable for like stopping things like the collapse of the economy and the collapse of the environment, and that it's necessary for innovation. I think being able to preempt all these things by earlier on by explaining why capitalism necessitates different types of growth and globalization and like exploitation can make it really essential for you to be able to like start that debate early on, whether or not they've explicitly said that they're going for impact turn earlier on in the debate. The next thing I want to talk about is the link kind of portion of the debate. I think that against policy teams, it is definitely obviously app dependent in terms of the type of link arguments that you should read, and most of the tips that I would give are just about the way in which you should be flexible in the type of research and the way that you build link arguments. I think that a lot of arguments that the capitalism kit is like most intuitively set up to deal with are arguments about resource management or the way in which we think about resource management, because I think that you have a lot of arguments in the literature base that are about why globalization and why capitalism necessitates growth and the ability to continue to exploit different types of growth and resources in order to continue its ability to remain like working and compatible with the current political system. And I think that also a lot of other link arguments that you can make are based in the ability to make arguments about how the state protects the private sector and the way that the private sector influences state management. The reason why I think these arguments are good is because there are a lot of arguments about the way in which the private sector is so profit driven that if you're able to win it, there's this kind of essential relationship between being able to think about the kind of like profit relationship from the private sector while also thinking about the way that influences policy, then you have a good amount of arguments to start being able to preempt possible permutation arguments or pivots that teams can make beyond the kind of impact turn debate. I think that when you're doing this and being able to win, that politics are heavily influenced by capitalism as a process, and being able to kind of win a structural argument about the way in which politics prioritizes economic stability, I think you have a lot of argument why the motivations behind the app don't actually resolve the type of arguments that you'll be making, which can help you a lot later on in this type of debate. In the next video, I'll kind of go over the second half of this debate, being like the permutation and impact comparison and the alternative portion of this debate. But hopefully this is a good starter for you to thinking about how you should be going for the Cap K against policy teams, and hopefully you'll tune into the rest of the lectures.